So you've gone through the gauntlet of the interview process round after round, and the recruiter calls you with the news that you've been hoping for. Hey, congratulations, we're actually working on an offer behind the scenes. We'll be back with you shortly. So you're elated, you're doing the happy dance, and you're waiting with bated breath for what offer they might be coming back with. But the inner workings behind the scenes are very mysterious, and oftentimes they take a long time to get that news back to you about what the terms of your offer are. So let's talk about exactly what happens after you conclude your final interview till the point where you actually get an offer in your hand. So the meeting behind the scenes at the conclusion of your interview is usually attended by human resources, the interview panel, everybody who actually interviewed you, the hiring manager, and then the recruiter. And then what typically happens is they'll make a decision on your candidacy. Everybody gives the thumbs up. And then it goes to offer, and then it's usually taken offline. So the rest of the interview panel kind of disappears, and the hiring manager, human resources, and the recruiter then start to discuss the terms of a possible offer. And usually what they'll do is they'll ask the recruiter to put together a suggested offer. Sometimes they'll have the recruiter go back and just reconfirm what the candidate, what their expectation is if it wasn't clearly covered in the interview itself, and any other terms and conditions. Maybe there's a relocation or any other things that we would likely need to get done. So oftentimes me as the recruiter, I will call you back up and say, hey, good news. Looks like there's an offer coming. Just want to go over a couple more details just to be clear on our salary requirements or any other details that need to be addressed. And then I will go back to the hiring team with that information. That being said, they will still reference the notes for the original submission. So whatever I send over in the very beginning at our pre-screen, as far as salary requirements and other conditions, they will use that as a basis. So you really want to make sure that you understand how to clearly answer the salary expectation question before you go into any interview process. If you need more help with that, I have some other videos. I'll leave a link for them. So then what I'll do as a recruiter is I will conduct a comparison. So I will look at internal equity for other people in a similar role inside of the organization. So we usually will pull 2 to 3 different comparables. We'll pull what their grade, their salary grade is, or salary band is. We'll look at how many years of service they have and what their job title is. And then we'll look for the more candidates we have, the better. Typically, we'll run reports off of payroll, and we'll be able to see kind of an anonymous list of payroll and comp. So then we will look at what your expectation is and then see how it kind of fits into the existing group. Obviously, if you're way outside of the range of the internal equity or the other people that are sitting in similar roles across our organization, then that could pose problems with your candidacy, and we may not be able to follow through with an offer if it's just too far out of whack. Or I may have to circle back with you and ask you if you would consider different terms and conditions just because of that disconnect. And the next thing we'll do is pull salary bands and ranges. So we usually have a list of ranges and job bands associated with each role. And depending on what the level of the role is, we will look and see how it fits into the min, the mid, and the max. And typically companies will want to come in at midpoint or a little bit above midpoint or lower, because usually the higher you get in the salary range, the less room you have to move as far as merit increases and yearly adjustments, because it's usually a kind of a scale where as you get higher up, the percentage of raise will get short. So it encourages you basically to get to the midpoint of the range. And then after that, it starts to slow down. And the reason why that is because they want to encourage people to continue to grow through salary bands or salary ranges. So in other words, if you get to the top end of your range, your raises get smaller and smaller and smaller because there's not as much wiggle room at the top. And therefore, in theory, they should be encouraging you to develop into the next band. So like promotion or something along those lines. If your salary band is too high for the job range as it's slated, then the company has a few different options. The first thing that they can do is they can go back to you and ask whether or not your salary range is, or your salary expectation is firm. And then they can try to fit you in there. So that's usually where you would find maybe a lowball offer, and it maybe isn't necessarily a lowball offer so much as you may be overqualified or over scope for the job. That's the first thing. And if the company decides to do that, it's usually not a positive outcome for the employee. And we as recruiters don't like to do those offers because they just generally don't, and nobody likes to get a lowball offer, including the recruiter. The second option is they can petition to move the job into a different band or a different grade. In other words, upgrade the role so that it qualifies for a different band. And typically the role would have to be enriched on some level. You just can't change bands arbitrarily and still keep the same compensation philosophy. So That is another option. And I see that happen very frequently, especially with candidates who come in and are really strong or superstar candidates, or they check every single box. Companies are more willing to go to bat for candidates who are really solid and are considered to be strong fits, or this kind of, I use the term superstar candidates or rock star candidates, and it's a little bit cliche, but essentially that's what it is. Or the final option is if they determine that your skill set doesn't stack up favorably to the people who are already in that role, and they're not willing to move the job band up, they may just opt to withdraw the offer altogether. And that's where it becomes kind of a little bit of a song and a dance with the recruiting team, especially in the very beginning. It's really important to make sure that you know where your skill set lies, to be realistic about it, but also know what the market in general is paying, because oftentimes those salary bands, and we will also use an additional data point, but they're usually tied into salary bands at some point, is salary data. We'll use like salary surveys that we'll get from industry. So we kind of, the company will keep tabs on what's going on in the broader market. So you, as the candidate, the job seeker, should also be doing the same thing. When you're doing your salary research, you should be looking at what are other employers paying, and how does my skill, knowledge, abilities, experience, education, certifications, all of things, how do those stack up to the market? And unfortunately, it can be difficult for some people to honestly assess themselves, because nobody wants to feel that their skill is lower than the market will bear. So once we decide what compensation philosophy we want to go with, then they'll take into account how strong of a candidate you were. So again, the salary band issue may be moved. They may enrich the role and get you into a bigger salary band. They may change the title around, but they'll also look at how strongly did you interview? Were you a really good fit? You could be less experienced than the person who's currently sitting in that role today, and you could still get the same compensation or even higher if you come in a high demand job, but B, you also know how to interview very effectively and convey your fit. So they'll take a look at their interview notes and determine how strong did you interview, how strong were you versus other candidates that they were maybe speaking to, and then how strong are you compared to the people who are currently sitting in those similar roles. And this next one will probably trigger some people, but to a lesser extent, they will take into consideration things like MBAs or pedigree of degree. If you don't bring the goods with the experience, because experience is going to be not even close, it's the most important thing or criteria that they will use to determine what your compensation should be. Those other factors, the MBA that you might have, or the master's degree, or the multiple degrees, honestly, again, I know this is going to trigger some people, but you probably value them more than most employers do, unless it's specifically stated on a job description that they're requiring that. So they'll take into consideration, they may give you a slight bump, or it might be a justification if you wanted to go back and counter the job offer for whatever reason. That might be a justification that they could go, okay, well, they do have the MBA or whatever. But in general, it's not a huge factor when determining compensation. So just keep that in mind. Now, I will put an asterisk here and say there are certain companies in certain industries that really value the education and the certifications and all of those things more so than other companies. So I'm just kind of, it's a blanket statement here. I can't possibly cover every single company in every single industry, but this is in general what would happen. And I'm not going to lie here, the employer will probably look at the job market and determine, is it a strong employment market? Are there a lot of jobs and not that many candidates, and so the employee has the advantage? Or is it a weak market where there's a lot of candidates, there's a lot of competition for those jobs, and maybe an employer can be a little bit less generous in their offer? I'm not saying a company will or won't do that, but that definitely does factor in. Certainly for some companies, they may have a bit more of a take it or leave it kind of mentality if it's a market that's not very advantageous for the job seeker. So once they come up with the number that they've all landed on with the total comp package and all the details of it, it will then go through an approvals chain. And this is where it typically takes a really long time. And it's very frustrating for the recruiter just as much as it's very frustrating for the job seeker who is anxiously waiting for this offer to come through. So then typically what their approval process is the recruiter will then submit, usually through the ATS system, a formal offer request. It'll have all the terms and the conditions, and then it'll usually have to go through a series of approvals. The first one is usually the hiring manager. So the hiring manager will get the terms of the offer. They have to go in and sign it and say, electronic signature, approve it. It will then usually get sent on to the plus one. The plus one is usually the manager, so the boss's boss. They'll sign off on it as a level 2. And then it'll go through, usually goes through human resources to get the third level sign off. And then the recruiter's usually the final sign off, just kind of more of a check and balance to make sure everything is clean and clear. And then the recruiter will then contact the candidate to present the offer to them. And that's usually, sometimes it could take several weeks, which again is annoying, but it is what it is. So then they'll contact you, they'll go through the terms of the offer, and then they will send an electronic copy to you so that you can consider it, do whatever you want with it, if you want to counter, etc. And then the whole process kind of repeats if you decide you want to counter it. So unfortunately, that's why offers tend to take a very long time. They have all of these things that happen after you finish your interviewing. And that's why people often get pretty paranoid about this process, because they don't have visibility behind the scenes, but there's a lot of moving parts. The recruiter is scrambling to do all of this work. It's usually a pretty significant amount of work to get an offer completed and approved and all of that stuff. And then oftentimes the offer will go and sit on somebody's desk, figuratively, it'll sit in their inbox, and then you have to go and nudge them, go 3 or 4 days. And inevitably there's always somebody that's on vacation, and you got to wait for them to get back, or you got to try to skip approval and try to get somebody else, another person, to sign off for them. And that requires some other hoops to jump through. And it's kind of convoluted. And I've never really encountered a company that has really figured out how to really streamline this process to make it shorter. Once you're dealing with the numbers and the bonuses and the equities and all of these, relocations and all this kind of stuff, it does get to be pretty complex. But that's what goes on behind the scenes. It's a lot of moving parts. It does seem like nothing is happening, but on the back end, there's a ton of activity going on. And hopefully this paints a little bit of perspective. Don't get paranoid if you don't hear back on your offer right away. There's just a lot of things going on to confirm the offer and get through approvals and get it into your hands. So hopefully that sheds some light for you. But if you're somebody that's saying, hey, this is great, I'm glad I have all this information, but I don't have any offers to even consider, that's actually something that I specialize in. I have a website called alifeafterlayoff.com, and it's loaded with all these insider tips and tricks. And I share my deepest and most intimate recruiting knowledge in the form of some training courses. And the first one is called Resume Rocketfuel. Resume Rocketfuel is designed to teach you how to write your own professional resume quickly and easily, with the stated goal of getting your name called for that first round interview. And then once you get into the interview process, it's up to you to market yourself correctly to get through each round, ultimately to get to the offer, and then to negotiate the best possible terms for yourself. And I actually have a course called the Ultimate Job Seeker Bootcamp, which teaches you how to do that. It gives you tips and tricks, how to interview with a degree of authority and confidence. And once you get to the offer process, how to make sure that you don't leave a dime on the table, and how you can play the chess game there masterfully so that you get the best possible package. That alone is typically worth the price of admission, and you can usually negotiate enough to pay for the course and then some. But the preferable method to getting hired is to not apply for the job at all, and it's actually to have the recruiter either come find you or skip the recruiter altogether. And that's where my course Unlocking LinkedIn comes in. It teaches you how to use LinkedIn to your advantage, how to set up personal branding so that you can get the recruiter to start discovering you, and then skipping the recruiter altogether and going right to the front of the line. And trust me, it is a lot easier to get hired when the recruiter is finding you versus the other way around. So if you're struggling at those interviews, you want those recruiters to contact you, check out the course Unlocking LinkedIn. Hopefully this demystified some of the hiring process for you. Appreciate you watching. Good luck on your job interview, and we'll see you on the next one.